The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rundown streets of Jamal's neighborhood. The air was thick with heat, dust, and the distant sounds of life's struggles. The buildings around him were crumbling, their once vibrant colors faded by time and neglect. Jamal, a 14-year-old boy with kind eyes and a resilient spirit, navigated the harsh streets, doing what he could to survive. His days were filled with scavenging for scraps and taking odd jobs for a few dollars, but his real survival instinct was his ability to avoid trouble. The streets could be deadly, and Jamal had learned to stay out of harm's way. But that evening, as he made his way home, something was different. A scream cut through the noise of the city. It was a high-pitched cry, filled with fear. Jamal stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. He scanned the street, trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from. And then he saw her. A little girl, no older than 6, was running down the street, tears streaming down her face. She was dressed in expensive clothes, a far cry from the rags most kids wore around here. Her blonde hair bounced as she ran, her tiny body looking so out of place in the chaos of the street. Jamal's eyes widened as he realized something was wrong. She was lost, terrified, and alone in a part of the city where no child should ever be. Before he could move, Jamal noticed a group of men a few yards away, their eyes locked onto the girl. Jamal's blood ran cold as he saw the malicious glint in their eyes. These men weren't just staring, they were calculating. They had noticed what Jamal had: the girl's expensive clothes and frightened demeanor. She was rich. She was a target. Jamal's heart raced. He knew exactly what they were thinking. They had spotted an easy mark: kidnap her, demand a ransom. It was the same thing that happened to kids in the neighborhood every so often, except this time, the kid wasn't from the block. This time, she didn't belong here. Jamal's first instinct was to walk away, to keep his head down and avoid the conflict. He knew what happened to people who got involved, but something inside him couldn't turn his back on her. She was just a little girl, so scared, so alone, and she needed help. He glanced at the men again. They were already moving toward her, closing the gap. Jamal's pulse quickened. He had a choice to make. He could pretend he hadn't seen anything, stay quiet, and let the situation unfold as it always did. Or he could risk his life for a stranger who, as it turned out, might not be so much of a stranger after all. In the span of a few seconds, Jamal made up his mind. He wasn't going to be a bystander. Not this time. He'd seen enough suffering in his life to know that standing by and doing nothing wasn't an option. This girl needed help, and he would give it, no matter the cost. He took a deep breath, clenched his fists, and moved toward the girl, ready to face whatever came next. Jamal didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he grabbed Lily's trembling hand and yanked her toward him, pulling her away from the men who were now beginning to shout and close in. His heart hammered in his chest, but he pushed the fear aside, focusing only on getting her out of danger. "Stay close," he whispered urgently to her as they darted into the crowd. People were bustling around them, unaware of the chaos unfolding in their midst. Jamal knew the streets like the back of his hand. Every turn, every alley, he'd memorized them all. But this time, he wasn't just running to escape. He was running to save someone else's life. Behind them, the men shouted, "Get her!" The sound of their heavy boots echoed in the narrow streets as they pushed through the crowd. Jamal could hear their panting, their determination to catch up. He glanced over his shoulder just in time to see one of the men, a tall figure with a scar across his face, break free of the crowd and lunge toward them. "Faster!" Jamal urged, pulling Lily along. His legs were pumping as fast as they could, but it wasn't enough. He could feel the man closing in, his breathing growing louder, more urgent. They reached an alley, and Jamal made a sharp right, heading toward a maze of narrow, twisting lanes. The alley was littered with trash, broken bottles, and graffiti-covered walls. He could hear the thugs behind them, but they were slower in the cramped space, their movements less fluid. Jamal knew he didn't have much time. He glanced over his shoulder once more to see the men stumbling through the alley, not far behind. The girl's sobs echoed in his ears, but he focused on pushing forward. They couldn't stop now. Turning the corner, Jamal spotted the old building up ahead. It was abandoned, its windows boarded up and its roof caving in. This was his refuge, a place he knew better than anyone. A place where he could hide, at least for a little while. "Hold on tight," Jamal told Lily as he pulled her toward the building. They ran up the crumbling steps and pushed through a half-open door. Inside, it was dim and musty, but Jamal knew this place well. He took a deep breath, feeling the relief wash over him for a moment as they ducked behind a pile of old furniture. The sound of footsteps was growing louder. The thugs were close, too close, but they hadn't seen them yet. Jamal pulled Lily behind a rusted filing cabinet and whispered, "Stay quiet. Don't move, okay?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Her small hand gripped his tightly as they crouched together, holding their breath. Outside, the men were getting closer, their voices booming as they shouted to each other. Jamal held his breath, praying they wouldn't find them. After what felt like forever, the footsteps faded, and the voices grew quieter. They had passed the building. For a moment, it felt like the world stood still. Jamal exhaled slowly, his body trembling with the adrenaline that had been coursing through him moments before. Lily looked up at him, her face still pale but starting to calm. "Are we safe?" she whispered. Jamal gave her a reassuring nod. "For now, we are." They sat in the abandoned building, waiting for the men to leave, hoping that somehow, against all odds, they had just made it out alive. As the minutes passed in the dimly lit abandoned building, the sound of the distant thugs slowly faded, leaving only the rustle of the wind outside. But inside, it was quiet. Too quiet, save for Lily's soft sobs. Jamal sat across from her, watching the little girl in front of him, shaking, trembling with fear. She was barely 6, so small and fragile, and it broke his heart to see her so terrified. Her eyes were wide and filled with mistrust as she looked at him, her hands clutching her dress tightly, her sobs quiet but frequent. "Hey, it's okay," Jamal said softly, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise. I just wanted to help." But Lily only shook her head, her face scrunched with fear. You're a stranger. You're not supposed to be helping me," she whimpered, her voice barely audible. Jamal felt a pang of sympathy for her. She was scared, confused, and most likely wondering why the world had turned against her. He couldn't blame her for not trusting him. She had just been through something unimaginable, and the last thing she needed was to be abandoned again, even by someone trying to help. He knew what it was like to feel abandoned, though. He knew the feeling of being left alone in a cold, indifferent world. Taking a deep breath, Jamal slowly sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't want to scare her more. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "I know you're scared," he said gently, his voice soft but steady. "But I'm not going to hurt you. I I know what it's like to be scared, to be alone. I've been on my own for a long time. My mom's sick, and sometimes we don't have much. But I always try to help, because I know how hard life can be. People don't always care, you know." Lily hesitated, her little face scrunching up as she processed what he said. She was still trembling, but her cries had quieted. "I know I'm not like you, and I don't know what it's like to have everything," Jamal continued, "but I know what it's like to be scared, to be hungry, to be alone, and I couldn't just leave you out there." Lily blinked, the tension in her face starting to soften. She looked at Jamal, her wide blue eyes studying him as if trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. Are you really going to help me?" she asked, her voice still shaky but now filled with a trace of hope. Jamal nodded. "I'm not going to leave you, I promise." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the only sound being the wind howling through the cracks in the building. Jamal could see the fear slowly fading from Lily's eyes as she took in his words, her face relaxing. Jamal could relate to her fear. He had known abandonment all his life. His father had disappeared when he was just a toddler, and his mother, though loving, could barely make ends meet, let alone provide all that he and his siblings needed. Life on the streets had taught him how to survive, but it had also made him hardened, cynical about people, about the world. Yet seeing Lily there, so vulnerable, awakened something deep inside him, a reminder that no matter how tough things got, it was always worth trying to help someone who needed it. "I don't have much," Jamal continued, his voice softer now, "but I'll make sure you're safe. I won't leave you. We'll figure this out together." Lily didn't say anything at first, but her eyes slowly began to soften as she processed his words. For the first time, she stopped crying and simply looked at him, her shoulders relaxing. "I trust you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jamal's heart swelled. He knew that trust was a fragile thing. In his world, trust wasn't easy to come by, and people didn't often give it away. But here, in this moment, it felt like a precious gift. And he wasn't going to let her down. "I'll protect you," Jamal said, determination in his voice. "But we have to get out of here. I don't know what's going to happen if the police get involved. They'll think I took you. We have to keep you safe until we figure it out." Lily nodded quietly, and with that, the bond between them was solidified. He wasn't just helping her out of obligation. He was giving her something precious, his trust, his promise, his protection. Together, they would face whatever came next. Jamal couldn't ignore the realization that hit him like a freight train. He had seen the missing person posters scattered across town, the same face he had been looking at for days. Lily, the little girl he had rescued, was none other than the daughter of Mr. Carter, a billionaire whose face was often plastered across the media. The news outlets covered his charity work, his business empire, and his wealth, but they also spoke about his family's personal struggles. His daughter had been missing for days, and now Jamal had found her. The weight of the situation began to press down on him. He looked down at Lily, still wide-eyed with confusion, sitting on the edge of an old bench in the abandoned warehouse they'd been hiding in. The reality of her identity made him freeze for a moment. This wasn't just some lost child. This was the missing heir to one of the wealthiest men in the country. Jamal felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't the world he belonged to. He didn't know what people like Mr. Carter would think of him, a poor, homeless boy who had only the shirt on his back and the will to do the right thing. Would they believe him? Would they accuse him of something terrible? The streets taught Jamal that sometimes people who didn't know the whole story saw the worst in others. He feared that his only good deed could be twisted into something darker. But then there was the threat of the men, the gang members who had been hunting for Lily since her abduction. They hadn't given up. They were still searching. Jamal knew he couldn't keep hiding in the shadows forever. He had to act fast. He needed a plan. After a moment of hesitation, Jamal stood up, his mind racing. He wasn't going to let fear stop him. He couldn't let these thugs get to her. He needed to make sure Lily was safe, really safe, before things went any further. The police were the only people who could protect her now, but there was still the question of how they would react. Would they see him as the hero or a potential threat? Would they trust him? Jamal's resolve hardened. If he took Lily back to her family now, the chances of the authorities thinking he was the kidnapper were high. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't let the men find her either. He decided to take her to a nearby police station, a place where she would be safe. He had heard about the local precinct where his older brother had once worked before he had gotten caught up in some bad decisions. The officers there were no strangers to the struggles of people from neighborhoods like his. Jamal hoped they would listen and see that he was just a kid trying to do the right thing. With a firm grip on Lily's hand, Jamal led her through the dark streets. He moved quickly but carefully, making sure they weren't spotted by anyone who might recognize him or be looking for the child. Lily, still silent, trusted him without question. Her small hand in his gave him a sense of purpose, like he was doing the one thing he had always wanted to do, something good. When they finally reached the police station, Jamal was nervous. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of bleach and old wood. A few officers were sitting at the desk, speaking in low voices. Jamal's heart pounded as he walked up to the desk. The officer in charge, a tall woman with short black hair, looked up and raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you, kid?" she asked, eyeing Lily and then looking back at him. Jamal swallowed. This was it. He didn't have time to second-guess himself. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and spoke clearly. "This is Lily Carter. She's been missing. I found her. But there are people looking for her, and I need your help. Please." The officer looked from him to Lily, her eyes narrowing as she took in the situation. For a moment, there was silence. Then she nodded and stood up, calling for backup. "Stay right here, kid," she said, her voice more gentle now. "We'll take care of her." As the officers took Lily into their custody, Jamal's mind raced. He knew his role in this wasn't over yet. His fear of being seen as the villain lingered, but he did what he could to help. That's all he could do. It was out of his hands now. Without another word, he slipped out of the station and disappeared into the night, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The hardest part was over, and now he had to wait for what came next. As Jamal waited outside the interrogation room, his heart pounded in his chest. The officers had taken Lily inside, and he was left in the cold, dimly lit hallway. He had hoped that he would be able to explain himself, but now, with every passing minute, doubt gnawed at him. He felt like the walls were closing in. What if they saw him as a threat, as one of the kidnappers? What if everything he did to save Lily only made things worse? Suddenly, the door to the interrogation room swung open, and Jamal was ushered inside. The officers' stern faces made it clear that they had already made up their minds about him. They wasted no time with pleasantries. One of them, a tall officer with graying hair, leaned over the table and shot a sharp look at Jamal. "Where did you take the girl?" the officer demanded. "What did you do to her?" Jamal flinched at the accusations. He wasn't used to being treated like this, but he knew he had to keep his cool. "I didn't do anything wrong. I found her, and I just wanted to help. She was lost and scared," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Before the officer could respond, the door swung open again, this time more violently. Mr. Carter stormed in, his face a picture of fury and frustration. His expensive suit was slightly wrinkled, as if he had been rushing to get here. When his eyes landed on Jamal, the anger in them softened for a moment, but it quickly turned back to sharpness as he looked at the young boy sitting there. "Why is he here? What's going on?" Mr. Carter barked, his voice demanding answers. His gaze was intense, and it was clear that he didn't understand why Jamal was being treated this way. The officers exchanged glances but said nothing, clearly unsure of how to respond. But before anyone could explain, a small voice piped up from the doorway. "He saved me!" Lily's voice rang out full of emotion. She ran into the room, her small arms outstretched as she bolted toward Jamal. She jumped into his arms, wrapping her tiny arms around him in a tight hug. "I'm not scared anymore, Jamal," Lily said, her voice muffled against his chest. Jamal, stunned by the overwhelming warmth of her gesture, held her gently. The officers and Mr. Carter were silent, their attention now fully on the scene before them. Mr. Carter's face softened, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. He stepped forward, slowly, carefully. The room felt much smaller now, the tension finally starting to lift. "Lily," he said quietly, his voice strained, "you're safe now. Thank God you're safe." He turned to Jamal, looking at him for the first time with real appreciation. "I don't know how to thank you. You did what no one else could. You saved my daughter." Jamal's heart swelled with emotion. He had never expected this, had never thought that his simple act of kindness would lead to such a profound moment. But there it was, unfolding in front of him. Mr. Carter's expression changed as he took a step closer to Jamal. His voice, when he spoke again, was softer. "I've heard of kids like you," he said, his eyes scanning Jamal's tired face. "You're a good kid, aren't you? Why didn't you ask for help? Why didn't you just walk away?" Jamal hesitated. He looked down, unsure of how to explain himself. "I couldn't leave her, sir. I just couldn't." Mr. Carter nodded slowly, as if the weight of what Jamal had done was sinking in. He looked back at Lily, still clinging to Jamal, and then back at the boy who had risked everything to save her. "You've got a heart, kid," Mr. Carter said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's more than I can say for a lot of people." Jamal could hardly believe what he was hearing. For the first time in his life, he felt like he mattered. And as the billionaire stood there, the weight of the world seemed to lift off his shoulders. The streets, the judgment, the struggles, all of it felt like it was fading into the background. In this moment, he had done something meaningful, and he had been seen for who he truly was. "Thank you," Jamal said softly, his voice shaky but filled with sincerity. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Mr. Carter smiled, his expression softening even further. "This is just the beginning, son," he said. "You've earned more than just my gratitude. You've earned a future." Jamal's heart raced as Mr. Carter spoke, the words hanging in the air like something too incredible to believe. For a moment, he wondered if he had misunderstood, or if this was just some fleeting dream. He had spent so many years surviving on his own, struggling to get by, that the idea of someone offering him more than just a chance at survival felt like a foreign concept. "You don't have to go back to the streets, Jamal," Mr. Carter continued, his voice warm but firm. "No kid should have to live like this. You saved my daughter's life, and for that, I'll make sure you have a future. You and your family will have a place here with us. You'll have an education, the chance to do whatever you want to do in this world. We'll make sure of it." Jamal blinked rapidly, trying to process what was happening. His mind raced with thoughts of how this moment could change his life. He had been on his own for so long, used to the struggle and hardship. The idea of stability, of belonging somewhere, felt impossible. His throat tightened as he fought to keep his emotions in check. He looked down at Lily, still holding on to him, her small hands clutching his shirt. Her innocent eyes were full of gratitude and trust, and it suddenly became clearer to Jamal than ever before. This wasn't just about saving her anymore. This was about having a chance at something better for himself, his family, and the future he had always dreamed of. I don't know what to say," Jamal finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought anyone would offer me something like that. I've been living on my own for so long, I didn't think anyone saw me as more than just a street kid." Mr. Carter's expression softened even more. "That's exactly why we need to change things. There are too many kids like you who feel invisible, who don't have a chance to show the world who they really are. But I see you, Jamal. I see your worth." Tears threatened to spill from Jamal's eyes, but he held them back. He had learned to keep his emotions hidden, to never show weakness. But in this moment, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Finally, someone believed in him, someone who didn't look at him as just a poor kid from the wrong part of town. "I don't want to just be someone you help out of pity," Jamal said quietly, his voice steady. "I want to earn this. I want to prove that I'm worth what you're offering." Mr. Carter smiled, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You already have, son. You've proven more than enough already. You've got a good heart, and that's all that matters." As the words sank in, Jamal felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had always carried the burden of his circumstances, his poverty, his isolation, his lack of opportunity. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of possibility. In the days that followed, Jamal moved in with Mr. Carter's family. He was given a room of his own, something he had never imagined he'd have. For the first time in years, he slept through the night without fear or worry about where he'd find his next meal. And every day, he was reminded of the kindness and generosity that had changed his life forever. Jamal's bond with Lily grew stronger as well. They spent time together, playing games and talking. Jamal promised to protect her, just as he had promised himself when he first saved her life. And as time went on, Jamal began to see not only a better future for himself, but a new future for the people he cared about. He had been given a chance to build something more than just survival. He could finally dream, and he could finally hope. One evening, as Jamal sat at the dinner table with his new family, he looked at Mr. and Mrs. Carter and felt a warmth spread through him. He realized that this family wasn't just offering him a home. They were offering him the chance to be part of something bigger than himself. Jamal smiled, his heart full of gratitude. He had found something that had been missing in his life for so long, a family. And no matter what happened next, he knew one thing for sure. He would never take this gift for granted. He would protect it, just as he had protected Lily for the rest of his life.